Welcome back, everybody, to Just the News, No Noise. That obviously is the House floor. If I had better vision and I could see my preview screen, I would tell you exactly what's happening, but I can't see it that closely. I don't know if the vote is actually underway, but we are obviously going to keep an eye on that and keep you posted. As many of you know, we've talked about this is the longest government shutdown in American history, and it may finally come to an end tonight. A deal is on the table. The House is voting on that funding package that could reopen the government and head straight to President Trump's desk for his signature. So joining us now to talk about this is Acting Director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies over at the Heritage Foundation, Richard Stern. Richard, thanks so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. You know, on one hand, I know that there are a lot of people out there watching the show who say, I didn't feel anything. I didn't even notice the government was shut down. But there are Americans who were furloughed, who were working without pay, and it definitely affected them. What's the damage to our country going to be, and what's the damage for Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's also one other burden that it created, which is that there are all of these laws and regulations on the books that our employers or businesses have to follow because of overregulation. But if there aren't federal bureaucrats, if the offices aren't open, then businesses have to navigate this as best as they can while taking risks and not being able to get the services they need to comply with the government's own regulations on them, let alone, of course, that air traffic control had to slow down the volume of airplanes going. The list goes on and on. It's going to total tens of billions of dollars, all because elected Democrats wanted $1.5 trillion more of your dollars for welfare, mostly for illegal aliens. It's a shame.
What are you hearing was in that deal? Because we all heard this kind of like mysterious conversation and deal making was taking place a few nights ago. But I mean, Democrats were very recalcitrant when it came to that $1.5 trillion regarding ACA, and Republicans were just as belligerent on the other side, saying, no way, Jose. What changed?
Well, I think what changed is honestly, Democrats got the electoral victories they wanted on Tuesday, and they know that the shutdown was starting to go south on them. We were starting to have real critical functions be collapsed and curtailed. And so I think Democrats looked at this and thought they got the political wins they wanted, but they were going to risk too much if they kept going. And of course, it allowed people like Schumer, who looks incompetent now, but it allowed him to try to look like he was of the base of his own party. His incompetence of politics and policy is a different matter entirely. But look, we don't really know what deal was cut. And you have to keep in mind, the funding of this bill will last for less than 3 months. And so this is just the beginning of all kinds of negotiations between both sides. And we could be back here again in January.
Oh my gosh, please, please no, please no. I want to ask you if what Chuck Schumer did worked, because we aired some footage at the top of this show of AOC, and it kind of seems like she's already running her mouth like Chuck Schumer betrayed his party.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think what he tried to do on the beginning of this is he wanted to have his moderates bail on him, vote to reopen the government, and do it in a way where they could go out and say, look, we're reasonable moderates in states that require that. And then for him and a lot of the other old guard to say, no, we're not establishment. We're part of the hip part of the party. We're progressives. We're cool. But the truth is, no one thinks that of the Chuck Schumer. And he, in my mind, failed at some of the minutia of how to deal these negotiations, how to address what was going on. So, look, I think that was his play to begin with. I think he was incredibly bad at doing it. And now he's left himself in a position where it looks like he's betrayed all of the sides of his party. And I think he's weakened his own position. So that's, I think, what he tried to do and the reality of how it went down.
If there is any universe out there that deems Chuck Schumer as hip, that is a universe in hell as far as I'm concerned. He's anything but hip. And he's also anything but dialed in with the youngest faction of his party, because they're all the AOC types and now the Zohran Mamdani types. I want to get into the economics of Zohran Mamdani, because I've seen a lot of these man on the street style videos, and most of the people who say they support Zohran Mamdani, I don't think that they really grasp what his policies would actually do to that city. But I want to hone in on one of them, the government-run grocery stores, because a lot of people have said it never works, bread lines, blah, 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 blah. Why doesn't it work?
So everything about business is incredibly complicated. And I think a lot of people like to pretend that business owners sit back, they enjoy their profits. But if you ever walk into a grocery store, there are a million things on the store shelves. They're all pretty affordable if you really think about it. And at the end of the day, it is incredibly complicated to make that work. Look, the government can't even figure out how to fill potholes or get your driver's license to you, in a quick amount of time sitting in a DMV. Do you really think the government and government bureaucrats can figure out the supply chains to get hundreds of thousands of items on store shelves across a region? Absolutely not. Grocery stores already operate at a profit margin of 1 to 3%, and it's a miracle. In fact, when Boris Yeltsin came to visit America when the Soviet Union was collapsing, what made him break down in tears was seeing a functional grocery store because they could not make that work in the Soviet Union. So that's why it always fails, and why, frankly, this is doomed to fail again in New York.
Richard, how quickly can these socialist initiatives that Zohran Mamdani wants to employ, how quickly can they happen? Because I talked about this last night on the show. I think a lot of people think that the worst case scenario is that Zohran Mamdani can do everything that he has said he wants to do. Now, the reality of it is that as a city mayor, as big as the city is, I personally don't think that he has the power to do everything that he wants to do. Now, my concern is not that he can do it all, it's that he can't, or that it happens a lot slower than he thinks it will. And then you've got this whole generation of Americans who watched young New Yorkers put Zohran Mamdani in power, and they watched the rest of the world who has half a brain that functions in economy say it's going to destroy New York City. And those young people are going to say, see, you told us that this was going to happen, that it was going to destroy the city, and it didn't. And then we're going to be in a scenario where they use that as a campaign point when you push people with a socialist agenda into offices that have even more power and can actually do these things quickly.
Amen. I think you hit the nail right on the head there. So, two things in particular: both the tax increases he wants to do, which, if he could do, would be crushing for New York businesses, and then the debt levels he wants to incur to fund all these programs. Both of those are capped by the state government. And so he would need the state government, the governor, the legislature, to sign off on these plans before he could do them. So it's not to say he won't do them, but that's a much harder hurdle to get through. The state government probably won't let him do in full what he's talking about. And you're right, this is going to be a rallying cry, a political campaign strategy, but he'll fail to meet all of his promises, and he'll use his charm and false words to pretend as if he got these things done. But make no mistake, the things he will do will be disasters. They'll raise prices, destroy businesses, decline job opportunities. And you're right, the idea disease of socialism spreading, that's the real threat here.
Yeah. And it's spreading among the youngest generation. And I think because there is I don't know if it's an ideas vacuum. I don't necessarily think it's an ideas vacuum, but there is a vacuum of some sort where young Americans feel like they cannot get ahead. They cannot get a leg up when it comes to their profession, when it comes to paying off their student debt, when it comes to buying a home, when it comes to owning a car. They feel like the older generations utterly screwed them, for lack of more appropriate terms. So President Trump floats this idea of a 50-year mortgage, and I'm seeing a few different reactions. The dichotomy between those who are saying, well, this is basically just a 50-year rental agreement. You don't necessarily own it, but you're locked in for 50 years to pay off something that you're not actually sitting on as an owner. And then I hear a lot of people who say, well, yeah, but you've got such a demoralized younger generation. And by the way, it's not just Gen Alpha or Zoomers, it's millennials too. So you've got these three youngest generations who feel like they cannot participate in the housing economy. And so maybe this is a way to kind of dip their toes in the water a little so that someday they can achieve home ownership. But maybe maybe between these two is the truth, but does it destroy our economy?
So here's the crux of this, which is that what we have is a supply problem, which is that we have an economy that's overtaxed, overregulated. And so the reason why houses, cars, all these other things are expensive is because there's very few of them, because we have made it physically so hard to build more of them. But a lot of people, especially younger people, are looking for frankly false promises. They want to do something. And so when a politician says, look, I'm going to do something that papers over the problem, that makes it look as if there's more stuff when there really isn't, they're increasingly going for it because it feels right. Look, there are a few regulatory things that we could change, that we should change, that make it easier for banks to offer 50-year mortgages. But to be fair, the proposal on the table right now would be for the government to subsidize them in a way that probably would raise house prices more than whatever the value would be of getting the interest rates down and getting the term length longer. Keep in mind the difference between a 30-year and a 50-year mortgage is only about a 10 or so % cut in monthly expenditures. And yes, having no equity in the house itself, it's mostly a false promise.
Artificially inflating prices. What could possibly go wrong? When have we ever seen that crash and burn a lot? Thank you so much for being here, Richard. This has been such a great conversation. You have such a great outlook on all of this. Very, very pragmatic. Thanks so much for being here.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. All right, everybody. Coming up, we are going to discuss the rapid development of generative AI technology and how some companies are asking for government cooperation. More on that after a quick break.